Hey everyone, this is a chapter from Alex Callinicos' book, Trotskyism. Um, I'm just going to release these as individual chapters, but the title of this chapter is uh, Origins. Section 1.1 Permanent Revolution. The origin of what would later be called Trotskyism can be traced back to the event which established Trotsky in the first rank of Russian socialists, the 1905 revolution. Until that upheaval, which at its climax in the winter of 1905-06 swept him at the age of 26 into the leadership of the St. Petersburg Soviet of Workers' Deputies, Trotsky had shared in the census among Russian Marxists about the immediate political future. The consensus among Marxists about the immediate political future. Marxism had emerged in Russia at the beginning of the 1880s in reaction to the dominant revolutionary tradition among the intelligentsia, populism. For the populace, deeply influenced by Western socialism, the transformation of Russian society, feudal, predominantly rural, presided over by the absolute monarchy of the czars, into an industrialized capitalist country like Britain was a disaster to be avoided at all costs. The communal forms of social organization surviving among the peasantry would allow Russia to sidestep the travails of capitalism and move directly to socialism. Increasingly, the populace saw their role as that of giving history a push, as Zelyabov sorry, let me look this figure up. Says that Andrei Zelyabov was a Russian revolutionary and member of the executive committee of Narodnaya Volya. After graduating from I'm not going to read the whole thing, that's too much. Narodnaya Volya was the late 19th century revolutionary socialist political organization operating in the Russian Empire, which conducted assassinations of government officials in an attempt to overthrow the autocratic Tsarist system. The organization declared itself to be a populist movement that succeeded the Narodniks, composed primarily of young revolutionary socialist intellectuals believing in the efficacy of direct action. Narodnaya Volya emerged in autumn 1879 from the split of an earlier revolutionary organization called Zemlya I Volya, Land and Liberty. Predecessor groups had already started using the term, quote, terror, end quote, positively, and Narodnaya Volya, in similar fashion, self-identified as terrorists and venerated dead terrorists as, quote, martyrs and, quote, heroes as part of a propaganda-driven campaign to attract attention to their moral justifications for using political violence. Based upon a secret society apparatus of local semi-independent cells coordinated by a self-selecting executive committee, Narodnaya Volya espoused acts of political violence in an attempt to destabilize the Russian Empire and spur insurrection against Tsarism, justified, quote, as a matter of exerting pressure on the government for reform, as the spark would ignite a vast peasant uprising, and as the inevitable response to the regime's use of violence against the revolutionaries, end quote. This culminated in the successful assassination of Tsar Alexander II in March 1881, the event for which the group is best remembered. The group developed ideas such as the assassination of the, quote, leaders of oppression, end quote, that were to become the hallmark of future small non-state groups, and were convinced that the developing technologies of the age, such as the invention of dynamite, enabled them to strike directly and precisely, minimizing casualties. Much of the organization's philosophy was inspired by Sergei Nechayev's The Propaganda of, end quote, propaganda of the deed, end quote. Sergei Nechayev and, quote, propaganda of the deed, end quote, proponent Carlo Pescana. The group served as an inspiration and forerunner for other social, revolutionary socialist and anarchist organizations that followed, including, in particular, the Russian Socialist Revolutionary Party. Although they were socialists and often associated with Marxism, they generally opposed it in favor of an ideal of anarchic self-government. So, back to the text. Increasing the populace saw their role as that of giving history a push, as Zhelyabov, leader of the terrorist Narodnaya Volya, put it, by physically destroying the autocracy which stood in the way of the socialist future. Plekhanov, the founder of Russian Marxism, set his face against such voluntarism. Socialism, Plekhanov argued, presupposed a development of the productive forces which only capitalism could achieve. The expansion of the market and consequent disintegration of peasant communities, which Lenin in particular analyzed and documented at the turn of the century, were historically necessary preconditions of socialist revolution. Russian Marxists on the eve of 1905 were unanimous in recognizing what seemed to be the political corollary of this argument, namely that the coming revolution would be, quote, bourgeois democratic, end quote. Like the English and French revolutions before it, in sweeping away absolutism, it would create the political framework within which capitalism could develop unfettered. There were, however, important differences about the role the key social classes would play in Russia's bourgeois revolution. Indeed, the historic split at the 1903 Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, RSDLP, between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, though precipitated by questions of party organization, was consolidated by disagreement over this issue. Plekhanov and the Mensheviks expected the liberal bourgeoisie to play the sort of leading role they believed its English and French counterparts had performed in their revolutions. On this prognosis, the task of the infant Russian workers' movement would be to support the liberals against the Tsar. Their time would come only after the autocracy had been overthrown and capitalism considerably expanded. By contrast, Lenin and the Bolsheviks contended that the belated development of Russian capitalism had rendered the bourgeoisie economically dependent on and politically subordinate to the state and foreign capital. Far from leading mass action against the absolutist state, the liberals would look to the absolutist state for protection against a proletariat that was already showing signs of getting out of hand. The workers' movement should in these circumstances assume the role abandoned by the supine bourgeoisie and lead the peasant masses against the Tsar. If the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party seized the initiative at a time of popular turmoil, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party might succeed in replacing the autocracy with a, quote, revolutionary democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, end quote, which would seek, within the limits of capitalism, to promote conditions as favorable as possible for socialist transformation. Lenin's analysis proved more accurate than Plekhanov's in both 1905 and 1917. Liberal capitalists on both occasions were afraid of insurgent workers and peasants, more afraid of insurgent workers and peasants than of the Ancien regime. Trotsky, while agreeing with Lenin, went much further. In the first place, Trotsky set the development of capitalism in Russia in the context of the world economy. The rapid industrialization promoted by the monarchy in cooperation with foreign capital at the end of the 19th century was a response to competitive pressures transmitted through the European state system. Military power now required an advanced industrial base. The result was an illustration of what Trotsky would later call, quote, the law of combined development, end quote. The, quote, drawing together of the different stages of the journey, a combining of separate steps, an amalgam of archaic and more contemporary forms, end quote. By virtue of, quote, the privilege of historical backwardness, end quote, Russia, rather than pass through all the separate stages traveled by countries such as Britain and France on their road to capitalism, could take advantage of the most advanced forms of technology and organization available in the West, importing the latest industrial plant. By the turn of the century, there were some of the largest and most modern factories in the world in Russia amid vast pools of rural poverty. The new proletariat, concentrated in a few major urban centers, could exert an influence quite out of proportion to its size. Suffering all the social miseries typical of rapid industrialization, denied the most elementary political rights, this working class would, Trotsky, like Lenin, believed, play the central role in the struggle against Tsarism. Thereafter, the two parted company. The Bolsheviks, Trotsky argued, overestimated the capacity of the peasantry to act as an independent social and political force. Quote, because of its dispersion, political backwardness, and especially of its deeper inner contradictions which cannot be resolved within the framework of the capitalist system, the peasantry can only deal the old order some powerful blows from the rear by spontaneous risings in the countryside on the one hand and by creating discontent in the army on the other. End quote. Trotsky. The peasantry could only act as a national force under the leadership of an urban class. The peasant parties, such as the social revolutionaries, which socialist revolution, it says social revolutionaries, but it's socialist revolutionaries. Yeah, it's called the Socialist Revolutionary Party. I guess that some people call it. It says that some people call it the Social Revolutionary Party, but yeah, I guess I'm wrong. The peasant parties, such as the social revolutionaries, which Lenin envisaged participating in the quote revolutionary democratic dictatorship end quote. Second. Come on. Excuse me. Sorry about that. The peasant parties, such as the social revolutionaries, which Lenin envisaged participating in the quote revolutionary democratic dictatorship end quote, represented the hegemony of the urban bourgeoisie and petty bourgeoisie over the rural masses. A coalition between such parties and Russian social democracy would inevitably succumb to the contradictions it contained. Either the proletariat would adopt a quote self-denying ordinance end quote, and refuse to use its political power to further its economic interests, in which case its position would be gradually eroded by the bourgeoisie, or would make inroads into the economic power of capital, for example, by taking over firms which laid off workers, in which case it would have crossed the boundaries of the bourgeois democratic revolution and established the dictatorship of the proletariat. Trotsky argued that Russian socialists should opt for the second course. Only thus, through a quote permanent revolution end quote, in which bourgeois and socialist elements fuse, could Tsarism be destroyed. This position left Trotsky isolated till the outbreak of the Russian Revolution of February 1917. Then the dilemma Trotsky had outlined more than a decade previously came to life. The liberal provisional government could only survive with the support of the Soviets, which it obtained not merely from the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, but also from many Bolshevik leaders, including Stalin and Kamenev. Lenin, on his return to Russia in April 1917, rapidly won the party to a very different strategy: the seizure of power by the Soviets on the basis of a program which sanctioned peasant takeovers of the gentry's estates alongside other demands, for example, workers' control of the factories, which implied a commitment to the construction of socialism. As many, quote, old Bolsheviks, end quote, complained, Lenin's April theses were tantamount to, quote, Trotskyism, end quote. The Bolsheviks' effective acceptance of the theory of permanent revolution helps explain Trotsky's decision to join the party in the summer of 1917. Another factor was also at work. Trotsky had since the 1903 Congress strenuously opposed Lenin's efforts to build a centralized revolutionary party. Like Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky had believed that the development of mass workers' struggles would generate the transformations of consciousness required for the proletariat to play the independent political role implied by the theory of permanent revolution. The Revolutionary Party would be primarily a reflection of the evolution of proletarian class consciousness. The February Revolution and its aftermath seem, however, to convince Trotsky that Lenin was right. Only a politically homogeneous vanguard organization such as the Bolsheviks could give the spontaneous movements of the class struggle the necessary focus upon the conquest of state power. Quote, without a guiding organization, the energy of the masses would dissipate like steam in a piston box. But nevertheless, what moves things is not the piston or the box, but the steam, end quote. Trotsky. From this perspective, without the Bolsheviks, the theory of permanent revolution would have remained despite all Trotsky's gifts as a mass leader. a purely intellectual construction lacking the mechanism capable of putting it into practice. The revolution of October 1917, in confirming Trotsky's prognosis, burst asunder the traditional categories of, quote, orthodox, end quote, Marxism. It was, as Gramsci put it, a veritable, quote, revolution against capital, end quote. In other words, it challenged the schema drawn up by Kautsky, Plekhanov, and other theoreticians of the Second International of history as a series of modes of production succeeding one another by iron necessity and culminating in the inevitable triumph of socialism. It was, however, only a decade later that Trotsky generalized what had been a specific analysis of the peculiarities of Russian historical development into a universal theory of revolution in the backward countries. The occasion was the Chinese Revolution of 1925 to 27. Stalin and Bukharin, then the leaders of the dominant faction within the Bolsheviks and therefore also in the Third or Communist International, Comintern, insisted that the Chinese Communist Party adopt a variant of the old Menshevik strategy, participating in a, quote, four-class bloc, end quote, with the nationalist wing of the bourgeoisie represented by the Gomindang, in order to achieve the, quote, national democratic revolution, end quote, required to rid China of foreign exploiters. Trotsky backed up a withering critique of the tactical errors involved. The Gomindang, after using the communists to defeat the warlords, then turned on and massacred them, with the general thesis that the bourgeoisie in the backward countries was no longer capable of playing a revolutionary role. But the same global processes of capitalist development, the interlacing of advanced and backward, which Trotsky called uneven and combined development, which bound these capitalists to imperialism, also created in countries such as China and India working classes capable, like their Russian counterpart, of exerting an influence out of proportion to their minority status. The hold of imperialism on the rest of the world could be broken only if the proletariat of the backward countries could lead the mass of peasants in revolutions which both eliminated pre-capitalist and colonial exploitation and initiated the transition to socialism. In its general form, the theory of permanent revolution implied a direct challenge to what after 1945 became the orthodoxy and Third World national liberation movements influenced by Marxism, Leninism, and its Russian, Chinese, or Cuban variants. Whereas these sought to construct coalitions following the Chinese formula of workers, peasants, intellectuals, and the, quote, national bourgeoisie, end quote, that is, those capitalists supposed to have an interest in breaking with imperialism united by the objective of national independence. Trotsky stressed the class antagonisms within such alliances and the distinctive character of the proletariat as the only force with both an interest in and capacity to achieve national liberation. A similar theme informs Trotsky's writings on Europe in the 1930s. Trotsky was fiercely critical of the Comintern's, quote, third period, end quote, policy in the late 1920s and early 1930s, which involved the powerful German Communist Party opposing united action with the Social Democrats against the Nazis on the grounds that one was as bad as the other. Trotsky was nevertheless equally opposed to the strategy adopted by Stalin in 1935 in constructing anti-fascist, quote, popular fronts, end quote, of the labor movement and the, quote, democratic, end quote, wing of the bourgeoisie. Rather than uniting the working class against fascism, Trotsky argued, the Popular Front governments in France and Spain represented the subordination of proletarian interests to those of capital, with results that could only strengthen Hitler, Mussolini, and Franco. As in the theory of permanent revolution proper, Trotsky here accorded primacy to independent working class action. Section 1.2, the critique of Stalinism. The generalization of the theory of permanent revolution made explicit what had earlier become implicit, namely that Trotsky's frame of reference was the capitalist world system as a whole. Quote, Marxism takes its starting point from world economy, not as a sum of national parts, but as a mighty and independent reality which has been created by the international division of labor and the world market, in which in our epoch imperiously dominates the national markets. End quote. Trotsky. Accordingly, Trotsky argued that while socialist revolution would begin in an individual country, socialist revolution could only be completed on a world scale. The internationalization of the productive forces achieved by capitalism meant that socialism could not be built in one country, and certainly not backward Russia. A worker state should act primarily as a platform from which to spread the revolution to other countries. Quote, the socialist revolution begins on the national arena. It unfolds on the international arena. The socialist revolution begins on the national arena. It unfolds on the international arena and is completed on the world arena. Thus, the socialist revolution becomes a permanent revolution in a newer and broader sense. The socialist revolution attains completion only in the final victory of the new society on the entire planet. End quote. Trotsky. In thus rejecting the possibility of socialism in one country, Trotsky was merely stating what was axiomatic to all Marxists in 1917. Lenin stressed on numerous occasions that the survival of the Bolshevik regime depended on the victory of revolutions in the advanced countries, especially Germany. The Bolsheviks accordingly launched the Comintern in 1919 with the aim of establishing a, quote, international Soviet republic, end quote. Marx had indeed warned that without world revolution, quote, privation, want is merely made general, and with want the struggle for necessities would begin again, and the whole filthy business would necessarily be restored, end quote. This prediction seemed to be confirmed by developments after 1917. No successful revolution in the West came to the aid of the Bolshevik regime. Industry collapsed under the impact of invasion, civil war, and blockade. The urban working class, which had made the revolution, sharply diminished in size and political enthusiasm. The Soviets consequently became the empty shells of proletarian rule, so that by the end of the Civil War in 1921, the Bolshevik Party, itself transformed into a bureaucratic organization interwoven with the state apparatus, found itself ruling in the name of a class which had effectively ceased to exist. I'll finish reading the sentence to see what I was going to say. Over a population largely made up of small-holding peasants whose natural suspicions of government were reinforced by the regime's commitment to collective rather than private ownership. Okay, let's break that down, what has just been said here. The working class in Russia didn't cease to exist. That's like the most astructural, like political, like or conscious understanding of what a working class is. To say that there was the working class had effectively ceased to exist is just fundamentally not true. The population, largely made up of small-holding peasants whose natural suspicions of government were reinforced by the regime's commitment to collective rather than private ownership. The reason that the peasant population was suspicious of the government, who had sanctioned their acquisition of land, is that during the Civil War, the Bolshevik Party, in order to win the Civil War, was requisitioning grain from the peasants at gunpoint. And there was mass famine in the early 20s. Not mass famines on the scale of the Stalin period, but there was large-scale famines going on in the countryside. And so when the government comes and takes your food and locks you up if you try to sell it, your suspicion towards the government is not based in this kind of private as opposed to collective ownership. It's not that couldn't be like a part of it. In fact, this is one of the critiques that I believe Rosa Luxemburg makes of the Russian Revolution, is the policy of land to the peasants being a bourgeois demand, because she knew that this is precisely what would happen. is that, which I don't think is actually 100% true. Like, I think the Mir survived, just in some extent, in certain places to until a collectivization period. But this was her critique: was that land to the peasants. Ultimately, the peasants wouldn't establish common ownership of the land, but would redistribute land among themselves into small private holdings, such as I believe what happened in the French Revolution. Yeah, the kind of like, I don't know. This is like the capitalist or conservative mindset of the peasants. Strictly speaking, is not the reason why they were hostile to the Bolsheviks. Back to the text. Sorry for that interference, but I'm thinking out loud here. It was against this background that, in the years after Lenin's death in January 1924, a bitter factional struggle developed among the Bolsheviks. Stalin, allied first to Zinoviev and Kamenev and then to Bukharin, owed his rise to the new bureaucracy of party secretaries over which he presided. The doctrine of, quote, socialism in one country, end quote, though formulated by Bukharin, is perhaps best seen as an assertion of the group's self-confidence. Dismissing the possibilities of revolutions elsewhere from their calculations, especially after the German Communist Party's failure to take advantage of the radicalization produced by the 1923 inflation, Stalin and his supporters asserted their capacity to reconstruct society using resources available within Russia's borders. For much of the 1920s, the strategy formulated by Karin and the right of the party was accepted as the best means of achieving this objective. This involved extending the new economic policy introduced at the end of the Civil War to conciliate the peasantry by relying on market incentives rather than coercion to provide the towns with food, even if this meant industry growing at, quote, a snail's pace, end quote, as Bukharin put it. Trotsky and the left opposition rejected this policy because it was likely to promote the development of rural petty capitalism, which would provide the socio-economic base for counter-revolution. Faster industrial growth would increase the size and social weight of the working class, a necessary condition of the restoration of democracy in both party and Soviets. Nevertheless, Trotsky argued no purely national strategy could resolve the contradictions facing the Bolshevik regime. Thus, a major theme of the left's critique of Stalin and Bukharin was the manner in which socialism in one country led to the subordination of the Comintern to the interest of Russian foreign policy and therefore to the squandering of major revolutionary opportunities. For example, in China in 1925-7 and in Britain during the general strike of 1926. Just a side note, I don't believe it was Bukharin's policy to isolate Russia from the world economy. I'm not exactly sure about it. I might be talking out of my ass, but that's to my understanding that was not Bukharin's understanding of what the Soviet economy should do and how it should orient itself. But I'm not sure. The final defeat of the opposition in 1927-28, which recent research has shown to have been less of a foregone conclusion than previously thought, took place in the context of an increasingly serious crisis involving worsening relations with the West, industrial stagnation, and an abrupt fall in grain deliveries. See Ryman, 1987. Stalin's response was to break with the right and resort to coercion to extract from the peasants the grain needed to feed the cities. This expedient became the starting point for a different strategy involving rapid, centrally directed industrialization and the forced collectivization of agriculture. Implemented during the first 5-year plan, which lasted from 1928 to 1930, the new policy transformed the USSR into a major industrial power, but at enormous human price. Collectivization led to the deaths of millions of peasants from repression, famine, or forced labor in the Gulag archipelago. Even modern Soviet estimates suggest that industrialization was financed by drastic reductions in real wages. This is written in the late 80s. The divisions these consequences caused inside the regime led in 1936 to the Great Purge, in which much of the old Bolshevik Party perished. Exiled from the USSR in January 1929, Trotsky sought to... Sorry, it takes me a second to get to the next page. Provide a Marxist explanation of this enormous transformation. Given its unprecedented character, it is hardly surprising that Trotsky's views on the subject should have undergone considerable changes. The thread running through these modifications is a preoccupation with the social causes of Stalinism. As early as December 1923, Trotsky was insisting that, quote, bureaucratism is a social phenomenon, end quote. Stalin was the representative of a distinct social layer, the bureaucratic caste, which had crystallized within the party and state after 1917. It was not, however, from the bureaucracy that Trotsky expected a Russian equivalent of the 9th of Thermidor, 27th of July 1974, when the Jacobin dictatorship under Robespierre was overthrown and a conservative reaction unleashed. The main danger of counter-revolution came rather from the, quote, new bourgeoisie, end quote, of kulaks, rich peasants, and netmen, speculators and middlemen who had benefited from the revival of the private market under the new economic policy. The Stalinist bureaucracy Trotsky saw as a, quote, centrist, end quote, force. Just as left social democrats such as Kautsky vacillated between reform and revolution, so Stalin balanced between the two main classes, the, quote, new bourgeoisie, end quote, represented by Bukharin in the right, and the proletariat championed by Trotsky in the left. Hence Stalin zigzagged from an alliance with Bukharin in the mid-1920s to forced industrialization and collectivization in 1928, a shift which many supporters of the left opposition welcomed as the adoption of their own policy, even though Trotsky himself had advocated much lower growth targets than those set in the first five-year plan, and opposed the coercion of the peasantry into collective farms. The events of 1927 to 28 did not lead Trotsky to alter his basic appraisal of the regime. One second, sorry, I'm looking things up on the internet. I'm not finding anything. Vladimir Smirnov. Vladimir Smirnov, who lived from 1887 to 1937, was a Russian communist revolutionary, member of the Bolshevik Party from 1907, and Soviet politician where he advocated a militant and doctrinally pure line. He was a persistent critic of successive party leaders such as Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, for which he spent years in prison and exile before being executed. So Trotsky is back to the text. Trotsky rejected this argument advanced by, it says Viktor Smirnov, but it's Vladimir Smirnov, and the Democratic Centralist faction as early as 1926 that a counter-revolution had occurred. Thermidor, in the sense of the, quote, restoration of capitalism, end quote, remained a, quote, danger, end quote, rather than an accomplished reality. Russia was still a worker state despite the bureaucratization of party and Soviets. Quote, the zigzags of Stalinism show that the bureaucracy is not a class, not an independent historical factor, but an instrument, an executive organ of the classes, end quote. The Stalinist regime represented a form of Bonapartism, like the Second Empire of Napoleon III, as analyzed by Marx in the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. Its power arose from an equilibrium between bourgeoisie and proletariat rather than from an independent socio-economic base. The task of the left opposition was not forcibly to overthrow the bureaucracy in a second revolution, but to subject the bureaucracy to democratic control by peaceful means. Quote, as the situation is now, the bourgeoisie could seize power only by the road of counter-revolutionary upheaval. As for the proletariat, it can regain full power, overhaul the bureaucracy, and put the bureaucracy under its control by the road of reform of the party and the Soviets. End quote. Trotsky. It was not any change within the USSR, but the failure of the Comintern's strongest section outside Russia to prevent the Nazi seizure of power in Germany, which led Trotsky to change his assessment. Quote, now we are in a new historic stage in which the policy of reform is exhausted, end quote, he declared in July 1933. Furthermore, quote, the thermidor of the Great Russian Revolution is not before us, but already far behind, end quote, having taken place in 1924. The Russian thermidor did not, however, represent, quote, the first stage of the bourgeois counter-revolution aimed against the social basis of the workers' state, end quote, as the left opposition had argued in the 1920s. The USSR was still a workers' state, albeit a degenerated workers' state, presiding over a, quote, transitional society, end quote, between capitalism and socialism. The state had, quote, a dual character, socialistic, insofar as it defends social property and the means of production, bourgeois insofar as the distribution of life's goods is carried out with a capitalistic measure of the value and all the consequences ensuing therefrom, end quote. Trotsky. This contradiction was intensified by the, quote, generalized want, end quote, arising from Russia's isolation after the revolution. It's probably going to say, yeah, it looks like this is the store analogy. The bread line, the lines of the store analogy. Quote, the basis of bureaucratic rule is the poverty of society and objects of consumption, with the resulting struggle of each against all. When there is enough goods in a store, the purchasers can come whenever they want to. When there is little goods, the purchasers are compelled to stand in line. When the lines are very long, it is necessary to appoint a policeman to keep order. Such is the starting point of the power of the Soviet bureaucracy. End quote. Trotsky. If the bureaucracy was a product of post-revolutionary scarcity, it was able thereafter to reshape Soviet society in its own interests, monopolizing political power and claiming for itself a host of material privileges. Trotsky nevertheless insisted that the bureaucracy, though, quote, the planter and protector of inequality, end quote, was not a new ruling class. Trotsky vehemently opposed the claims by some of his supporters that Stalinism represented either state capitalism or a new variant of class society, bureaucratic collectivism. The bureaucracy was, quote, a temporary growth, end quote, the product of a, quote, accidental, end quote, i.e. temporary and extraordinary enmeshing of historical circumstances, end quote, above all the failure of revolution in the West. The relations of production were still those established by the October Revolution. Quote, the nationalization of the land, the means of industrial production, transport, and exchange, together with the monopoly of foreign trade, constitute the basis of the Soviet social structure. Through these relations established by the proletarian revolution, the nature of the Soviet Union as a proletarian state is for us basically defined, end quote. State ownership of the means of production was that's end quote Trotsky. State ownership of the means of production was thus a necessary and sufficient condition of the existence of a worker state. As Max Shachtman pointed out, this amounted to the abandonment of the criterion Trotsky had used earlier, quote, namely, does the working class still have political power in one sense or another, even if only in the sense that it is still capable of bringing a straying and dangerous bureaucracy under its control by means of reform measures, end quote. Trotsky now believed that the working class could only remove the Stalin regime by revolutionary means, but that this would be a, quote, political revolution, end quote, which would leave intact the, quote, economic foundations, end quote, of Soviet society, amounting rather to a, quote, second supplementary revolution against bureaucratic absolutism, end quote. Section 1.3 Revolutionary Prospects. The conclusion, however, qualified that a new revolution was required in the USSR placed a heavy burden on the shoulders of Trotsky and his followers. Although increasingly subject to repression by the secret police within the USSR, the left opposition was able to attract a scattering of support in the various communist parties. Often accident played a role. James P. Cannon, then a leader of the Communist Party of the USA, read a document by Trotsky which was distributed by mistake to delegates of the Sixth Congress of the Comintern in 1928, and was convinced by the arguments it contained. As was usual in such cases, Cannon was soon expelled from the Communist Party USA. Nevertheless, the International Communist League, formed by the Trotskyists in 1930, regarded itself until 1933 as a faction of the Comintern, committed in line with Trotsky's reform perspective to winning the communist movement away from its Stalinist leadership. I want to read some Wikipedia introductions. The Sixth Congress of the Communist International was held in Moscow from July 17th to September 1st, 1928. The Congress was attended by 515 delegates from 65 organizations, including 50 communist parties and 57 countries. Adopting the theory of the, quote, third period, end quote, the Congress proclaimed social democracy to be, quote, social fascism, end quote. The other thing I wanted to look up in the International Communist League, just to see if there's anything in there that I don't already know that's important. Okay, I'm not seeing anything for it actually. Nevertheless, the International Communist League, the ICL, formed by the Trotskyists in 1930, regarded itself until 1933 as a faction of the Comintern, committed in line with Trotsky's reform perspective to winning the communist movement away from its Stalinist leadership. Hitler's victory in Germany, however, represented for Trotsky an event comparable to the Second International's capitulation to imperialist war in August 1914, proclaiming the Comintern's irredeemable bankruptcy. It was necessary now to build a new, Fourth International, which, while basing itself on the Bolshevik tradition and on the first four congresses of the Comintern between 1919 and 1922, would seek to build revolutionary parties in place of the bankrupt Stalinist organizations. The task thus set was immense. The International Communist League enjoyed negligible support. The International Communist League's two most important sections were probably the Russian and the Chinese, to which many Chinese Communist Party leaders had rallied after the debacle of 1925 to 27, including the initiator, one of the initiators, I believe the main guy of initially of Chinese communism, Chen Dushou, joined the left opposition. The Russian left opposition was destroyed in the late 1920s by mass arrests and deportations to the Gulag, where its supporters displayed such courage and determination, notably in the hunger strike they organized at Vorkuta in 1936-37, as to earn even Solzhenitsyn's grudging admiration, though not to save them from execution. I want to read the Wikipedia intro for Vorkuta log. Vorkut log. Vorkuta corrective labor camp, commonly known as Vorkult log, was a major Gulag labor camp in the Soviet Union located in Vorkuta, Komi Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic from 1932 to 1962. Vorkutlag was one of the largest camps in the Gulag system. The camp housed 73,000 prisoners at its peak in 1951, containing Soviet and foreign prisoners, including prisoners of war, dissidents, political prisoners, quote, enemies of the state, end quote, and common criminals who were used as forced labor in the construction of coal mines, coal mining works, and forestry. The camp was administered by the Joint State Political Directorate from 1932 to 1934. The NKVD from 1934 to 1946, and the Ministry of Internal Affairs Soviet Union from 1946 until its closure in 1962. The Vorkuta Gulag was the site of the Vorkuta Uprising in July 1953. This is not the hunger strike that's being referenced, but I want to look at this real quick anyway. The Vorkuta Uprising was a major uprising of forced labor camp inmates at the Reklag Gulag Special Labor Camp in Vorkuta, Russian SFSR, USSR, from the 19th of July or the 22nd of July to August 1st, 1953, shortly after the arrest of Vladimir Lenin. The uprising was violently stopped by the camp administration after 2 weeks of bloodless standoff. Back to the text. The fate of the Chinese Trotskyists was little less tragic. They were broken by the repression mounted against them by the Kuomintang, the CCP under Mao Zedong, and the Japanese occupying forces alike. See Wang, 1980. I'm going to assume that's Wang Fanxi, but I'm not sure that's being referenced. The ICL's, the International Communist League's effective membership was therefore concentrated in Europe and the Americas. Its sections in these countries were tiny. One of the most important, the American Communist League, claimed 154 members in 1931. Worse, the persecution of the Trotskyist movement in the communist parties, reaching a crescendo during the Moscow trials of 1936-8, which sought to establish that Trotsky, along with other Bolshevik leaders such as Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin, was in league with Hitler, helped confine these groups to the margins of the working class movement. While there were exceptions, the American Trotskyists were transformed by their role in leading a mass strike of Teamsters in Minneapolis in 1934. If you're listening, whoever's listening, you should check out. There's a very good documentary about the Teamster strike in 1934. You should check it out. And the first British group was in large proportion a continuation of an older tradition of proletarian Marxist autodidacts. See Groves, probably, I think it's Reg Groves. He was like one of the leaders of the Balham group, which was the first main Trotskyist group within. I think they were kicked out of the Communist Party of Great Britain. I think they were operating within it at first, I'm not sure. And McIntyre, 1980. The International Communist League sections typically occupied a social milieu frequently described by Trotsky as, quote, petty bourgeois, end quote, a ghetto of middle-class intellectuals for whom sectarian disputation all too often became an end in itself. The International Communist League's chief asset in these circumstances was Trotsky himself. His stature as with Lenin, the chief leader of the October Revolution, earned him international attention out of proportion to his actual political influence. Trotsky's years in exile were enormously productive intellectually. Not only did he write some of his greatest works, My Life, The History of the Russian Revolution, The Revolution Betrayed, which is on this channel. But in a series of occasional pieces, he examined the major crises of the day: the rise of Nazism, the Spanish Civil War, the Popular Front in France, creating a body of political analysis which can only be compared in its scope and penetration to such writings of Marx's as the 18th Brumaire and the Civil War in France. Yet the intellectual power of this body of writing is matched only by its complete lack of political impact. The most striking case is that of the series of articles and pamphlets in which Trotsky, with prescience and increasing urgency, analyzed the social roots and political dynamic of German fascism and warned of the disasters which would follow the failure of the communists and social democrats to unite against Hitler. Among Trotsky's greatest writings, they had no influence on events in Germany, where the International Communist League section amounted at the time of the Nazi victory to perhaps 100 members. I can't remember exactly, but one of the people that was the Lenin Bund that Trotsky could have aligned with, and I don't know what the actual relationship, so I'm kind of talking on my ass, but I believe they were one of the first people to argue. I think it's Hugo Orbans was one of the first people to argue really strongly that the USSR was no longer a worker state. Yeah, it says the Lenin League, or the Lenin Bund, was a German revolutionary socialist organization that was active during the period of the Weimar Republic, founded in 1928 by former left communist members of the Communist Party of Germany. The Lenin League experienced a number of splits over the years before going underground in the wake of the Reichstag fire and finally disappearing by the outbreak of World War II. Yeah, I can't really read all that. Trotsky therefore sought through a succession of different tactics both to increase the International Communist League's size and to root its affiliates in the working class movement. Perhaps the most important of these stratagems was the, quote, French turn, end quote, so called because Trotsky first proposed it for the French group in June 1934, which involved the International Communist League sections joining the social democratic parties, which were then experiencing a revival, indeed radicalization, largely in response to the destruction of the Austrian and German labor movements in 1933 and 1934. This first use of the tactic of, quote, entrism, end quote, by Trotskyists did not involve any expectation that they could take over and transform the social democratic parties. Indeed, Trotsky argued that, quote, entry into a reformist or centrist party in which it itself does not include a long perspective. It is only a stage which under certain conditions can be limited to an episode, end quote. But the French turn did not bring about any qualitative change in the situation of the International Communist League. In a remarkable interview with C.L.R. James in April 1939, Trotsky acknowledged, quote, we are not progressing politically. Yes, it is a fact, which is an expression of a general decay of the workers' movement in the last 15 years. It is the most general cause. When the revolutionary movement in general is declining, when one defeat follows another, when fascism is spreading over the world, when the official, quote, Marxism, end quote, is the most powerful organization of deception of the workers and so on, it is an inevitable situation that the revolutionary elements must work against the general historic current, even if our ideas, our explanations are as exact and wise as one can demand, end quote. Trotsky. Despite these adverse circumstances, Trotsky decided to press ahead and launch the Fourth International to replace the Common Turn. At its founding conference on the 3rd of September 1938, attended by delegates from the 11 sections, the Fourth International World Party of the Socialist Revolution, to give the new international its full name, claimed probably optimistically 5,395 members, of whom no less than 2,500 belonged to, by far, the strongest group, the Socialist Workers' Party in the United States. See Reisner, 1973. Trotsky nevertheless predicted, quote, during the next 10 years, the program of the Fourth International will become the guide of millions, and these revolutionary millions will know how to storm earth and heaven, end quote. What grounds did Trotsky have for such optimism? In the first place, Trotsky had a rather catastrophic assessment of the economic prospects of world capitalism. Quote, mankind's productive forces stagnate, end quote. Trotsky declared in the Fourth International's program, The Death Agony of Capitalism and the Tasks of the Fourth International, which is up on this channel. The likelihood of any sustained recovery from the Great Depression, which had struck the global economy after the 1929 Wall Street crash, was negligible. Indeed, quote, the disintegration of capitalism has reached extreme limits. The further existence of this system is impossible, end quote. The real obstacle to its overthrow lay in the domination of the workers' movement by forces. Stalinism and social democracy, which did everything in their power to prevent socialist revolution. Consequently, quote, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership, end quote. Trotsky. See Reisner, 1973. Only the absence of authentic revolutionary parties prevented the conquest of power by the working class. The scale of the economic crisis, however, would provide the means. One second. Only the authentic revolutionary parties prevented the absence of authentic revolutionary parties prevented the conquest of power by the working class. The scale of the economic crisis, however, would provide the means for resolving this crisis of leadership. The orientation of the masses, quote, the orientation of the masses is determined first by the objective conditions of decaying capitalism, and second by the treacherous politics of the old workers' organizations. Of these factors, the first is, of course, the decisive one. The laws of history are stronger than the bureaucratic apparatus. As time goes on, the Stalinist and Social Democrats, efforts to hold back the wheel of history will demonstrate more clearly to the masses that the crisis of proletarian leadership, can be resolved only by the Fourth International, end quote, Trotsky. It is in passages such as this that Trotsky seems most vulnerable to the charge of historical fatalism. The claim is sometimes made that the assumption that the development of the productive forces renders socialist revolution inevitable is constitutive of Trotsky's thought. See Hodgson, 1975, Molyneux, 1981, Beilhartz, 1987. This seems much too strong. The experience of the 1917 revolution, and in particular the role played by the Bolsheviks led by Trotsky, to argue that, quote, faith in automatic evolution is the most important and characteristic trait of opportunism, end quote, and to stress the importance of the, quote, subjective factors of history, the revolutionary will and revolutionary consciousness of the working class, end quote. Trotsky even argued that without Lenin, the Bolsheviks might have failed to seize the opportunity offered by the fall of the Tsar. But it does seem that, in the atmosphere of isolation, persecution, and defeat to which Trotsky and his followers were condemned in the late 1930s, Trotsky gave way, at times at least, to the belief that, quote, the laws of history, end quote, would allow the Fourth International to gain a mass following. Trotsky was also influenced by a historical analogy. In the last few years of his life, he frequently compared his present situation with that of the extreme left of the Second International during the First World War. Initially isolated and subjected to repression, Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Karl Liebknecht and other revolutionary opponents of the war found they were able to gain increasing sympathy for their stance as discontent grew at the front and in the factories. A process which culminated in the Russian revolutions of 1917 and the German Revolution of 1918. As it became clear that another world World War was inevitable, Trotsky predicted that it too would end amid social convulsions. After the outbreak of the Second World War, he claimed, quote, "The war will last until it exhausts all the resources of civilization or until it breaks its head on the revolution," end quote. Trotsky. The upheavals Trotsky foresaw and which he expected would be, if anything, greater than those of 1917 to 18 would allow the Fourth International, like the Bolsheviks before them, to escape from their isolation and gain the confidence of growing numbers of workers. Trotsky was not alone in this prognosis. In the last days of peace, the French ambassador to Berlin told Hitler that, quote, "As a result of the war, there would be only one real victor, Mr. Trotsky," end quote. A third consideration underlying Trotsky's hopes for the Fourth International concerned the USSR. In China, Germany, France, and Spain, the influence of the communist parties on the most militant sections of the working class had led to squandered revolutionary opportunities. The Second World War would, however, in all probability doom the Stalin regime to collapse. Trotsky wrote in May 1940, quote, "The epoch of great convulsions upon which mankind is entered will strike the Kremlin oligarchy with blow after blow, will break up its totalitarian apparatus, will raise the self-confidence of the working masses, and thereby facilitate the formation of the Soviet section of the Fourth International," end quote. Trotsky's belief that the Stalinist bureaucracy was, quote, "but a special, exceptional and temporary refraction," end quote, of the, quote, "general laws of modern society under the conditions of a backward revolutionary country in a capitalist environment," end quote, was one of Trotsky's chief reasons for resisting the arguments of Max Shachtman and his supporters that the USSR was a new bureaucratic collectivist class society. Quote, "Might we not place ourselves in a ludicrous position," end quote, he protested in September 1939, quote, "if we fixed to the Bonapartist oligarchy the nomenclature of a new ruling class just a few years or even a few months prior to its inglorious downfall," end quote. Trotsky died at the hands of a Russian agent. Downfall, end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky died at the hands of a Russian agent on the 21st of August 1940. Within 5 years, events were to demonstrate the flaws in the analysis on which Trotsky had based his very optimistic expectations about the growth of the Fourth International. These errors should not, however, be allowed to obscure the scale of Trotsky's achievement during the years of exile. In circumstances of great adversity, Trotsky sought to preserve the classical Marxist tradition, not merely by reaffirming its principal positions, but by extending it, first in the general theory of revolutionary strategy and tactics implicit in his writings on Britain, Germany, China, Spain, and France, and secondly in the Marxist explanation of Stalinism, which he initiated, above all, in the Revolution Betrayed. Trotsky ensured the continuity of the revolutionary socialist tradition also through his efforts to build the Fourth International. He confided in his diary in March 1935, I cannot speak of the, quote, indispensability," end quote, of my own work, even for the period from 1917 to 21. But now my work is, quote, indispensable, end quote, in the full sense of the word. There is no arrogance in this claim at all. The collapse of the two internationals, bracket, of social democracy and Stalinism, end bracket, has posed a problem which none of the leaders of these internationals is at all equipped to solve. The vicissitudes of my personal fate have confronted me with this problem and armed me with important experience in dealing with it. There is now no one except me to carry out the mission of arming a new generation with the revolutionary method over the heads of the leaders of the Second and Third Internationals. ... I need at least 5 more years of uninterrupted work to ensure the succession," end quote. Trotsky had those 5 years, during which he trained the, quote, new generation, end quote, in the tradition which had triumphed, albeit briefly, in October 1917. But Trotsky's heirs were all too soon put to the test of confronting a world very different from the one Trotsky predicted at the end of his life had led them to anticipate. Okay. The end. Thanks for listening.